Good afternoon, everyone. It's Erica Fine. I'm the Advocacy Director at Win Without War. We are going to get started. I think one of our panelists will be joining us momentarily. It's really wonderful to be with you this afternoon, and unfortunately we can't be in person, but this is definitely the next best thing. Once again, I will just say I'm Erica Fine. I'm the Advocacy Director at Win Without War. We are a diverse network of activists and organizations working for a more peaceful, more progressive U.S. foreign policy. And for too long, U.S. foreign policy has been in the hands of an elite, largely white group of people making decisions that benefit too few and harm too many. The United States posture towards Iran reflects that reality, where aggression and economic warfare are daily realities, and all-out war seems to be just a pin drop away. In January 2020, we came very close to that moment of war, but it was met with a massive mobilization that demonstrated what polling has long showed, that the people of this country don't want a war with Iran. So today's panel is all about this. We're going to talk about what we've learned from that January mobilization, how we can use those lessons to continue building an international, intersectional movement that can lead us ultimately to a place of peace. So really light fare, really easy stuff for us to unpack today. But really the great news is that we have 4 amazing panelists who are going to help us answer these questions. And I really want to take a moment to recognize that in a panel on Iran, we have 3 people of Iranian descent talking about it. And that really is a novel concept in the realm of US foreign policy discussions that happen in the United States. So we're very happy to have this, this different way here. And we're also really grateful to have a member of Congress who gets the importance of movement building. We have 50 minutes to go over this really massive topic, and undoubtedly we won't have time to get to everything. But with that, I'm gonna go over a few housekeeping items. So if you have questions throughout the panel, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to answer them when the Q&A portion comes up. We will not be answering them in the middle of the panel. If you're having tech issues, use the chat feature, and the person that's the Netroots behind the scenes person will be helping with that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm not going to read their bios just because of the short time frame that we have here. But we have, and he is here, but not yet on this side of the Zoom. We do have Congressman Ro Khanna from California with us. We have Rana Epting, the Executive Director of Move On. Azadeh Shahshani, Legal and Advocacy Director of Project South. And Azadeh, I'll let you pronounce your last name when you get to it. And Nahid Sultanzadeh, Digital Organizing Fellow of Empower Change. Because I think we're still having some tech issues, I'm going to ask the first question to Rana, and that is how we will do the introductions. I will ask each panelist a first question, and they will have several minutes to answer, and then we will have another round, a quick lightning round of questions, and then we will open it up to the audience. So Rana, I will turn to you now. When we were on the brink of war in January, a coalition of groups came together very quickly to mobilize national actions around the country against the march to war with Iran. NIAC, About Face, DSA, War Resisters League, Win Without War, Move On, and dozens of other groups came together in a matter of days and pulled off over 400 actions around the country to make the anti-war majority visible. What did you learn from that rapid response campaign about where people in this country are, about what it will take to mobilize again should we have to, and how things have changed since the Iraq War days.
Yes, thank you, Erica, so much. And hello, everyone. Really happy to be with you virtually if we can't be here in person. So I'll summarize a bit. First, everyone here is very familiar to Move On. We're no stranger to Netroots, and you know us. We've been around for 20 years, and we're an ever-growing and changing, diverse community of millions of people throughout the country that take action, from signing a petition to propping up a protest in their neighborhood. So generally, we see ourselves as here to support people to take action in their communities to make this world a better place. And we have a long history in anti-war work, starting with the march, or the protests against the march to war with Iraq. And that's actually how I came into the Move On community. I was invited to join a protest in downtown Portland, Oregon, back in 2001, 2002. And it awakened me that there are people all over the country like me that believe that war is wrong, period. And it felt naive and silly when I was in my mid-20s, but when I showed up in that place and I saw thousands of people standing together that also agreed, I felt not naive and silly, I felt righteous and very grounded in my principles. And so that's the power of protest, that's the power of digital mobilizing and digital organizing. And just wanted to say a bit about our legacy as Move On. So when our government assassinated Soleimani in a matter of days, a dozen groups, previously many of us disconnected from one another or focused on our own campaigns or our own rapid, need to resist in this moment, we came together very quickly in solidarity to push back against Trump's chaotic attempt to pull us into another senseless war, and this time with Iran. With the murder of Soleimani, we were quickly alerted by national news or our own family. I remember getting a text from my cousin, and we were alerted just how dangerous of a situation we were in. This felt very different than the other threats or attempts by Trump to really break up peace with Iran. And I can't speak for every group in the coalition, but within hours, we knew there was a real threat. Within 24 hours, we knew we had to organize a massive, large-scale mobilization to make the anti-war majority visible. And within 48 hours, we were able to test the waters with allies and our members, and we knew that there was support and sufficient energy to press go. And the question was how? How do we do it rapidly and quickly together? Many of the groups you mentioned, Erica, plus others, anchored the mobilizations, and we're able to pull off over 400 actions across the country in a matter of days. In DC, we had a large-scale action with numerous members of Congress who joined us to speak. And the day before, it was very interesting. We met, I remember, with Women Without War in Nyack, we met with the Congressional Progressive Caucus members who were in the midst of taking decisive action to limit the president's ability to go to war. And it was very clear from that meeting that public pushback out there in the streets was essential to shore up our legislative allies that knew that they needed to do something. And it was essential to pressure those who were on the fence. And if we could do that, we could successfully box Trump in. So our theory of change was that we knew the very left, like the old school anti-war left, it would not be sufficient. Their protests, I think there were some protests that Saturday morning, would not be sufficient to hold the space and to push back on Trump and Congress. And that we needed to mobilize and show the majority, to show up. And if we didn't, it would show that there was a void or an apathy out there in the country that isn't true. And so we needed to move quickly. We needed to move together. And I'll just say a bit about what we learned. So sorry, that was a long intro, but what we learned, I'm going to it's like a mix of what we knew and what was affirmed and what we learned. So there are gaps in the coalition. We had not, Move On is a multi-issue, multiracial, multi-identity organization. We had not had strong relationships with the Iranian diaspora community, the Iraqi community, Afghani community, even though I'm Iranian American. We had not been in practice working together beyond the foreign policy tables that we sit in and talk about legislative strategy. In terms of rapid response mobilization, we had some muscles that we needed to build together. So we knew there was a gap, and we knew that the anti-war majority needed to have breadth and depth. It needed diversity and identity and geography. And that we had some work to do to knit that tapestry, but that we also didn't have the luxury of time to do it perfectly, which is always, always the challenge in rapid response. You know the missteps you're making as you make them, and still you have to keep going forward. So we also knew we must center the voices of those most impacted. Being a new executive director myself and an Iranian American, I felt a great sense of duty to mobilize the Move On community in this moment for my people, and a sense of duty to live up to our anti-war legacy. But I also recognize that my personal identity is not equivalent to the organization I lead. It is related, but it's not equivalent. And as a new ED, this is the first time I wrestled with that dynamic in a very profound way. So I personally learned a lot about running a national mobilization rapid response organization. Have I landed on the perfect recipe? No, but it's complicated is the answer. I'll be quick. And then we also knew we couldn't do it on our own or by ourselves or with a savior complex, but it had to be done at the behest of the Iranian, Iraqi, Afghani, Muslim diaspora communities in this country most impacted, and that they needed to be at the forefront if and when possible. Okay, so lastly, we knew we had to pull off the mobilization and get better right away quickly. So even though the mobilization wouldn't be perfect, although it was powerful, it was not perfect, we knew we had more work to do. So we followed up after the mobilization events. We followed up, well, actually, let me say one more thing. National rapid response mobilizations at scale are run by member volunteers. So we knew the quality control would not be consistent. We had some very strong actions that did center the voices of those most impacted, and we had others throughout the country that definitely did not. But we took that risk because we knew we had to get people out in the streets to push back. And then in terms of the follow-up and continuing to strengthen our rapid response no war with Iran infrastructure, we knew that was essential, and we needed to prepare for next time. Monica Razi was already volunteering her time to bring together this network and build this muscle and to build lasting infrastructure. So we decided to ensure she was financially supported to continue that essential work. And Mana brought together with Benjiwe McHarris, they pulled together a full day strategy session after this with Empower Change, DSA, War Resisters League, About Face, NIAC, Win Without War, many, many others, Hoda Katabi and Farhad Ibrahimi, many other Iranian organizers, 30 plus groups that are now part of this coalition. And that led in, I know Nahid will speak to this, that led into anti-war organizing and campaigns thereafter, including actions like 80 hours for 80 million, where we called to put an end to US sanctions on Iran of the US Treasury. So I'll stop there, that's a lot, but we learned so much, so it's hard to summarize.
Yes, thank you so much, Rana. As I said, it's going to be very hard to cover everything in 50 minutes, but we will do our best. So I'm going to turn now to the congressman. As we know, simultaneous to these mobilizations that were happening around the country, we also had really rapid response action taking place in Congress in January. And that came on the heels of a successful amendment that was passed in July of last year to stop a new unauthorized war with Iran that had overwhelming support from the House, including from 27 Republicans. So Congressman Khanna, welcome. And how did that work inform the action, the quick action that you took in January? And what are the prospects for related actions in Congress in the future?
Well, Erica, thank you for having me. And thank you for all the work Win Without War did on that initiative. I think what it shows is that grassroots mobilization and organizations can make a huge difference. A lot of times people are cynical and say, what difference can we make on foreign policy. But both in the case of Yemen and Iran, it was really grassroots activists that changed the conversation and had a concrete result. We were able to insert, as you know, an amendment into the defense authorization bill saying there can be no war with Iran, that the funding can't be used to have a war with Iran. That passed the House overwhelmingly, and a lot of that was due to the great mobilization that so many groups did, that so many activists did, that so many people met with their members of Congress, got them to co-sponsor, built a broad coalition. And even though it was stripped from the Senate in the conference committee, it sent a message to the White House and to Trump that there are both Republicans and Democrats opposed to this action, and that he would really find it unpopular in Congress to do that. And I know Republicans who spoke with him and believed that that was one of the factors that made him not escalate the situation into war. So Congress sort of did wake up from its slumber. The Senate didn't, but at least the House did. And that was a direct result of citizen mobilization. So the point is that groups, activists, citizens can have tremendous impact by pushing Congress to pronounce on matters of war and peace and not just defer to the executive branch. Alyssa Slotkin led a great effort after that, also based on a lot of effort and mobilization to have a war powers that clearly said that Trump could not go to war with Iran without coming to Congress. And Tim Kaine did that in the Senate. And again, while it didn't get signed by the president, these kind of votes show the executive that it would be unpopular and hurt their capital to go to war once Congress pronounces. And we haven't had, unfortunately, Congress taking these positions enough over the last 20 years. That's how we got into Iraq, authorized by Congress, or in other cases, Congress was silent when we went into Libya or went into other situations. So I think there is a new paradigm. There is a new opportunity for a coalition that extends beyond party. And I would just encourage everyone who cares about more restraint, cares about a foreign policy based on more cooperation and engagement, to be involved, to talk to your members of Congress, to engage in groups like Win Without War, and help us continue to shift foreign policy in this country.
Thank you, Congressman Khanna. We will now turn to opening remarks from Azadeh. And Azadeh, of course, while a major conflict didn't take place in January, there is still a lot of turmoil and aggression between the United States and Iran that impacts Iranians and members of the Iranian diaspora communities in very real ways. Can you speak to the toll that this administration's Iran policy has had on people of Iranian descent inside and outside of Iran?
Thank you so much, Erica, and thanks also to Congressman Ro Khanna and Rana and Nahid for having this panel. So just a couple of words on the context of US aggression. I just want to talk for a couple of minutes about my own personal history. So I was born in Iran in February 1979, actually 4 days after the Iranian Revolution. My name Azadeh means free-spirited in Persian, signifying the hopes of my parents and many others for what the revolution would bring. Their hopes were soon to be dashed, however, as the oppressive regime of the Shah of Iran was replaced by a theocracy that soon crushed all of its opposition. And as Iran got entangled in the 8-year Iran-Iraq war initiated by Saddam Hussein's 1980 invasion into Iranian soil, the United States government unequivocally supported the Iraqi dictator. I clearly remember the nights when the four of us, my parents, my sister, and myself, would hold hands and sit underneath the stairs in our house in Tehran with a blanket around us in an improvised tent with all the lights off as sirens warned of a missile attack by Saddam's forces. And of course, we were among the lucky ones. Our house was never hit. Others were not so lucky. Iranians, especially those near the border, had their houses and sometimes entire neighborhoods flattened and were made refugees. 1 million people lost their lives in the war. In addition, thousands of Iranians were killed by chemical weapons utilized by Saddam. All of us who lived in Iran during that time bear the psychological scars of the war. I remember how I felt even as a young child about US government support for an invader who was bombing us indiscriminately on a daily basis. To add insult to injury, in July 1988, a US warship shot down an Iranian civilian airliner flying near the Persian Gulf, claiming that it had mistaken it for a military fighter jet. All 290 people on board the aircraft were killed, including 66 children. The United States government later decorated that captain, Captain Rogers, for, quote, exceptionally meritorious conduct as commander of the warship during that time. So this is just a very brief history of US intervention and support for aggression against Iran in recent history. And of course, in the first 10 days of the year, I, like many Iranian Americans, started the new year with a feeling of doom. The realization that the fate of 81 million people rested entirely on the whims of one man was just unbearable. As a vocal critic of war, I started getting attacked immediately. Someone accused me of, quote, siding with the enemy. These feelings of despondency were heightened after hearing accounts of fellow Iranian Americans being targeted by the government. In early January, scores of Iranians and Iranian Americans, some of whom US citizens, were held at the border and questioned extensively about their political opinions, including their views about US aggression against Iran. This was very clearly intended to shut us up and force us to be silent in the face of aggression against Iran and oppressive US government policies. Custom and Border Protection denied that people were being targeted because of their Iranian descent, but in an email, a border officer said they were in fact told to target Iranian-born travelers. The officer said that the only reason Iranian Americans were detained and questioned that weekend was due to their ethnicity, and that the operation was unethical and possibly unconstitutional. And people can see the actual directive now that's available online for yourself. On top of this, since August, more than a dozen Iranian students with valid visas pursuing higher education in the US have been detained for long hours and questioned extensively at various airports while being treated in a very humiliating fashion before having their visas revoked and being sent back to Iran. This having gone through a notoriously long vetting process. At least one student said he was forced to wear handcuffs and leg cuffs. These are students pursuing PhDs in this country or wanting to pursue PhDs. One student, Amin, who was going to start a PhD program at the University of Florida, said he was chained and taken to an immigration detention center here in Georgia, where he was imprisoned overnight. He said, "The moment I entered the cell, I lost my spirit." At a rally at the Atlanta airport following the enactment of the Muslim ban 3 years ago, or almost 4 years ago now, I posed the question, is being Iranian American, Iraqi American, Libyan American a crime in Trump's America? The same question still lingers in my mind and in the minds of my fellow Iranian Americans, many of my fellow Iranian Americans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Azadeh. And we will now turn to final opening remarks from Nahid. And to do that, I will ask you this question. So Nahid, as a campaigner at Empower Change, you have to take these very complex issues and ensure that they're engaging enough to motivate people to act. That's a really challenging job when it comes to US aggression toward the Iranian government, a regime that regularly harms regular people in Iran. So how have you now navigated that challenge in the No War with Iran campaign, and then the follow-on mobilization that happened in the coronavirus era with the No COVID sanctions on Iran campaign?
Thank you, Erica. That is such an important question. But before I answer that, I just want to say thank you so much, Azadeh, for sharing that story. My sister is kind of the same age as you. So like I wasn't born when that war happened, but those stories are alive in my family too. Let's just take a second to take that story in. Thank you, Azadeh. I think for me to answer that question, especially about, because I think there are two parts to that question. One is holding those complexities, and then the other is motivating people to engage in a conversation and in actions that are based on those super complicated issues. For the first part, I think it is important to like share a little bit of context about my own positionality in this fight and Empower Change's position. Empower Change is the largest grassroots Muslim-led organization in the country, digital native first. And our base is mostly Muslims, immigrants, or the people who identify as allies of Muslims and immigrants in this country. We work at the intersections of tech justice, decarceration movement, surveillance, and anything related to the civil liberties of Muslims in the US. And then me, I am a campaigner in this organization. I am a queer Iranian immigrant. I was born and raised in Tehran. I moved to the US 5 years ago. So I'm still super, super connected to what is happening on the ground there. My family still lives there. So many of my friends are there. So much of my time, just like I spend it on video chats with my people who are there. And I think both of these things about Empower and about me really shaped how Empower as an organization approached this fight, and the way that Linda Sarsour is our ED and one of the founders of our organization, allowed me as a very new organization to take the lead on that work, really shapes the way that we held those complexities. I think the most important thing that we need to remember as campaigners, as EDs, as activists, when we are dealing with issues so complicated like this, is, especially around issues of foreign policy, is all people's right of self-determination. That is something that we keep leaving out of the conversations about Iran, especially when it comes to the Iranian regime. But when you put that in the center of everything that you do, everything that you say, everything that you tweet, you just automatically, you are moved away from that false binary that is you are either pro-war or pro-Iranian regime. That is something that especially Iranian American activists, especially Iranian activists who live in the US, constantly find themselves trapped in, from trolls on Twitter or even like family members. That is so heartbreaking. That happens all the time, that like, oh, you're against sanctions? Are you pro-regime? I'm like, no, anyway. So that is the thing that like moves us away from that. Like, it is not this regime or that regime. It is the people. It is about the people, and you do not have to like support one regime's violence to oppose another regime's violence. So that is basically what we were trying to do, both at Empower, and also that is what I saw my role in the coalition as a bigger formation that came together super quickly when January happened. I think we did a lot of work to, at Empower Change, we did a lot of work to craft messaging that helps even progressives in the movement who are not familiar with such a complicated issue of like tensions between Iran and the US and the history of it. And then they're like, oh, but like the Iranian regime kills gays. You know, there are all these things that are, yes, these are hard, but here is what you should not be saying. Here is what you should, in no way you should not be talking about this. One of the most important things, the January escalations were not about Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani is a super complicated character. I personally was not talking about his murder as like whatever. I'm out of my depth there. There is so much regional politics that is involved in there, but that's not a problem. The problem is that the people in Iran do not want this. So we did a lot of work to craft a messaging guide that everyone could access, every organization who wanted to be part of this could access. And then because the folks leading the messaging work in the coalition were all either Iranian immigrants or Iranian Americans who were super connected to the struggle on the ground in Iran, we were able to uplift the voices of organizers in Iran. We were able to uplift and statement from Amir Kabir University students rejecting US imperialism in all of its forms, war, sanction, any intervention from the US, and also at the same time rejecting the oppression of the Islamic Republic. We would not be able to do that if we were not connected and we were not following the leadership of them inside of Iran. There is also a super, super important difference when you talk about Iranian diaspora, when you talk about the Iranian American community and the Iranian who are inside of Iran. And then very quickly so that is how I like hold those complexities as a campaigner. Really quickly about how to motivate people to engage in something that is so complicated, while here in this country, we are also dealing with a lot. People are already like fighting to survive. They are fighting to like, for so many things. We are fighting for so many things that something that is happening on the other side of the planet might not be interesting for people. They're like, I don't have capacity for this. I care for people, but I don't have capacity for this. Our way of approaching this is to show the connections. All of this is connected. Militarism is connected to police violence, is connected to the prison industrial complex. All of these issues are connected, and they are also very, very deeply connected to the systemic Islamophobia that our people experience here in the US. So it is not like, and these two things, what our government does abroad, our militarism, is intensified and also is intensified by and also intensifies the systemic Islamophobia here, as Azadeh was saying, that every time the tensions go up, I get super aware of my Iranianness. Like I remember on that day, the day after Soleimani's murder, I went to the store and the person was like, oh, you have an accent, where are you from? I was like, oh, I'm from Iran, which is something that I easily say all the time. But then immediately everyone was like, and I was like, oh, we don't say that anymore as easily. So if you show those connections to people, people do want to join the fight, because it is not just the fight for Iranian people. It is the fight against violence, the fight against militarism, the fight against police brutality. All of these things are connected. We just need to have the language to talk about it, and we have to offer that language to the people that we want to bring on board with us in the fight. I think I went a little bit over time, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. Thanks, Nahid. That actually really segues very well into the lightning round question that I want to ask whoever of the panelists want to answer. And, you know, we're really, one of the things that we're trying to do at Win Without War, and that I know everyone on this, everyone on the panel is trying to do, is really break down this false idea that foreign policy is just should be in the hands of very few people. It's not different from domestic policy in the way that it affects the lives of people in this country and around the world. And, you know, one of the ways we're trying to do that is to ensure that impacted voices are heard and that impacted communities are centered in our government's decision making, which obviously has not been the way of this government for decades, if it ever was, right? So, let's talk about how is the No War with Iran campaign done in that regard? How, and if we've done well, how can we build on it? Anyone want to take that?
I have things to say, but I have been talking, so let's.
Go ahead, Nahid. Yeah.
Okay, just really quickly, I think as we talk about how No War with Iran campaign did, we also need to talk about how No War with Iran campaign is doing, because the work is still ongoing. We are not done. Iranian people are still dying because of the sanctions. It's just like, it's not so urgent and it's not an emergency. It's not so fancy as it was in January. It is a very slow motion emergency. People are dying slowly. They don't have access to food. They don't have access to medicine. And then COVID is happening, and the entire like public health infrastructure of Iran has been so negatively impacted by the sanctions. And then especially in this moment, Erica, I think this question is super important because we are approaching the elections. We are approaching, like, Joe Biden is talking about, has like opposed the sanctions during COVID, and then he's talking about going back to JCPOA, the nuclear deal, the Iran deal. everyone is talking as if Iran is still the same country as it was 4 years ago, as if the only country that goes through shifts of power, shifts of like domestic politics is just the US. Iran is still there waiting for US to come back to the table. So I think this is where it's so important to still always, not just in the moments of emergency, not just when we are on the brink of a war, we still need to center those voices. And if we want to do that, we need to make sure that we are following the lead of BIPOC-led organizations or BIPOC-led formations or groups that are taking shape in this moment, that took shape in the moments of emergency in January. Like No War Campaign is such a huge formation from organizations from all over the movement. But then we need to make sure that we are listening to people of color who are leading the formation, and we also need to materially support them. Like you can't just say the thing that, like, yeah, we are like following the lead of these people, but there is no lead of these people if there is no money for them to do their work. So that is something that I think we don't talk about it often enough in our movement spaces, which I think is super important. And then, yeah, just like Congressman Rouhana was saying, keep getting engaged in this work. I'm gonna put a little plug here. Text change to 67076. This is not a Biden plug, this is an Empower plug. And then you will get on our mailing list, and then we are a Muslim-led organization. And I'm not just saying this is not just an Empower Change plug, it is a people of color-led organizations plug. Follow their work, donate to them, just support them in whatever way you can, because those are the organizations, those are the people that have those relationships already and can bring these people together, just like it happened in January with No War Campaign. Yeah, that's my.
Wonderfully said, and good organizing. I'll just add a few points just to add to what Nahid said, not anything more, but I do think that, you know, the No War with Iran mobilization in January was a moment in this country where there was clear energy out there, hundreds of thousands of people, and it was the right thing for us to leverage that and to make it visible. But in terms of how the campaign is going, I will say 2 points. One, if you don't recall, if we want to recall, right off the heels of that, COVID-19 came to the United States. Tens of millions of people are now out of work. It's the inconsistent federal handling of the crisis. 160,000 people we have now lost. And then we saw the convergence of the economic and health crises come together with the convergence of Black America and so many other Americans that have had enough with the police violence against Black people in this country. And we saw the uprising. So these are important moments in our country and in our world, but the air for all of these crises at the same time is limited. And so in terms of the zeitgeist and like what people are talking about, thinking about, you're not hearing about Iran on at least in cable news. You have to look for it. And so what that means, like kind of why I wanted to lift that up, is that actually what is happening there out in the world impacts how the progressive ecosystem moves and sways. So you have organizations that are like Empower and focused on, I shouldn't speak for you guys, but we have a multitude of organizations. I will speak for like multi-issue, multiracial organizations like Move On or Indivisible or other organizations like us that aren't of don't have a lot of common shared identity. It is a diversity, a robust stew of everybody. And we have a whole slew of issues that we would campaign on, we recognized in the strategy session that we were very clear that groups like Move On, we will be there in those moments with more, we will be able to add more capacity in those high pressure moments, but we are not able, because we're working on COVID and, you know, policing and elections, we're not able to consistently be there at the same level throughout the entire year. So what our calculation was, we need to figure out how we support the knitting together of the movement between the different communities. How do we do that like, we don't need to lead it. We don't need to be out front. How do we do it? I think this is the first time I've shared it with anyone. How do we do it quietly and support that? And for us, it was supporting Mana to be able to stitch that together. I think there's more we could do, and this conversation is reminding me of some of the additional things we could be doing. But in terms of how it's going, I think we learned a lot as big mass membership groups about a healthier way for us to engage. And Iran is just one of many countries that that the United States is going to provoke war with. And so if you could imagine if it was another country, like, I don't want to identify one, but if it was another country, there's an entire additional community out there that we would need to start building that network with and those relationships with, and make sure that we were centering those voices. And it takes time. You try to do it as quickly as you can when you need to mobilize, but really the work is staying there throughout and figuring and being prepared for the next moment that you know will come, so that groups like Move On and others can show up in their right way. So I'm very appreciative for Nahid's leadership and so many others in the coalition that have been patient and really wonderful partners to help us think about how we engage helpfully. Because I mean, let's face it, most groups don't have 10 million people on an email list that they can communicate with right away and say, take to the streets. And so it is an incredible asset. And the question is, how do we use it responsibly and respectfully to show up for one another? And that's kind of, I just wanted to make sure he added that point there.
If you can just add very quickly, just to, and thank you both for the comments, just to follow up on what Nahid was saying earlier in terms of, making connections. So, as we're talking about, US, the white supremacy in the US and, police violence, let's also talk about the white supremacist roots of US foreign policy. And, really let's talk about and frame it in terms of US imperialism, and feature the voices of people who have been at the receiving end of US imperialism and militarization and bombings for, many, many decades. Those are the voices that need to be heard, because, there was this dichotomy also, in the past 2 or 3 months. Why are the police on the streets employing, militaristic tactics? Okay, well, if those tactics that we all know are repressive and horrible and should be eliminated are wrong here to be deployed on the streets of the US, then those tactics are also wrong to be deployed against brown and Black people elsewhere. So we really need to be talking about that as well. And, if we're talking about, abolishing police, why don't we talk about, abolishing the Pentagon, abolishing the CIA? So I think that's sort of the next step for our movements.
I want to go back to the sort of the fact of life that, Iran is, escalation tensions with Iran are always present, but they're not always in the news. And I want to ask Congressman Khanna, because we saw, so one of the things that happened was that in January, right, the war powers resolutions were passed in the House and the Senate and then vetoed by Trump. But you, Mr. Khanna, along with your colleagues, pushed for additional legislative action. And I'd love to, and then that ended up happening, right? There was a vote in the House to repeal the law, the 2002 AUMF, that was being used as the justification for this attack against the assassination of Soleimani. And also there was another vote on your legislation to prohibit unauthorized war with Iran. And I think that was somewhat surprising. And I would love to know from you why you pushed for that additional action when Congress had already acted? And what do you think does that set a precedent at all?
Well, I appreciate that. I think first we need to, as a Democratic Party, offer a expansive definition of national security. So I disagree. Obviously, we need the Pentagon and military for national defense, but what we don't need is a bloated military budget, which is $140 billion higher than where Obama left it. And wouldn't it have been better if we had put some of that into public health? Wouldn't it have been better if we put some of that into protecting us from climate change? So I think the Democratic Party can offer an expansive definition of national security that says we are going to make sure that we keep America safe. And we recognize, of course, one component of that is a strong military. But right now, we're not going to pay for huge Trump bloated increases. And that's why we had a 10% cut, which would have actually still been higher than the Obama budget, but put it in areas which would have kept people safe. And I think your point on legislative action is absolutely correct, that it wasn't just sufficient to pass the amendment or Slotkin's resolution. We wanted to do it as standalone legislation. And the reason that matters is that every time Congress acts, the world pays attention, the administration pays attention, Iran pays attention. So we have this huge force. Our voice in Congress matters. And it's not just about the nuts and bolts of getting a bill passed and signed by the president, though that's ideal. It's also that any action in committee on the floor sends a message to so many stakeholders. And so when Congress stands up and says no on war, when we stand up and say no on foreign interventions, that shapes policy. And that shapes policy, especially when it's done with groups like Win Without War and other advocacy groups for a more just foreign policy.
Thank you. And we have about we actually only have a few minutes left, and we have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm going to go to the anonymous question about bridging the gap between national security and foreign policy experts and wonks who are advocating for no war with Iran and grassroots advocates who are pushing in the streets for change. There sometimes is a disconnect between strategies, and I think that is partly true. More broadly speaking, there's often disconnects between what members of Congress want to do and what activists on the street want to do. So I think the question is, how do you bridge those divides? How do you make sure that the wonks, the so-called experts, are talking to people who are impacted, activists, and and how do we make sure that members of Congress are also in that equation?
Well, I could just say that I think it's so important that it's a collaborative. I mean, you don't have the energy to get something through Congress if there's not the activism. You won't get members paying attention to it. You won't get people co-sponsoring bills. But you also need the policy experts to help draft the language of the bills, to help shape the policy. And it can't just be passion. It has to be combined with expertise. And this is where the Quincy Institute and some of the new think tanks that have come out offer an intellectual framework for the progressive vision that can help take the ideals that people are fighting for and operationalize them and put them in legislation. And then members of Congress can help actually be the bridge between the policy world and the world of activism. So I think it's a very astute question that you really need all three operating in tandem to bring change.
And I also, great response. And I'll just add, I think it's a systemic problem to legislative policymaking, period. I mean, the best policymaking is the policymaking that takes into account the voices and experience of those that are going to be impacted. And I think on the left, based on the work I've done throughout the movement, I've seen we could do a lot better job. Where in my previous roles in the progressive left at other organizations that do lobbying and crafting of policy, the best policy I've seen created is when you're involving the people. So at SEIU, we were crafting policy around workforce investment, and we had drafts, and then we brought our union members in to DC for 2 days to talk through what are the challenges, do these policy solutions actually meet them? And turns out, no, they didn't. And we redrafted the entire proposal. And I think that that's just not a practice that's normally used in traditional DC legislative entities, and it's something we need to get better at. But I guess, like, my point is, it's not just specific to the foreign policy space, although I do think that is a particular area of concern, and Representative Khanna spoke wonderfully on that.
Just to add, I mean, from our perspective, and I work with Project South, we're a social justice organization based in Atlanta, based in the traditions of the Black radical tradition. So from our perspective, the work needs to be led always by directly impacted people, and that the only meaningful, long-lasting change in US history has happened as a result of movements led by people, such as the end to US war on Vietnam. And again, I would encourage everybody to really start, framing US foreign policy in terms of imperialism, because there's very clear history of many, many US wars. And so there needs to be an end to it. There is no space for US imperialism, and that just needs to end. And, endless US wars need to end. US sanctions against the people of Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, many other places in the world that are, trying to exercise their self-determination need to end. And that's just the end of it. So I think, once the framing is clear and the goal is clear and the leaders of the movement who should be directly impacted people are clear, then everybody else knows their place, which is to support the folks and the struggle.
Very well said, Azadeh. I'm going to, it looks, we're really about to wrap up. So I'm going to ask for everyone to add closing thoughts. You can add your own or respond to this question, which is, what is your, in the event that we have a Biden administration, what is your hope for this movement? What do you see happening, and what is your hope? Because I think we've built something really meaningful, and do we see that continuing and strengthening as we move towards a hopefully less chaotic time?
Well, I think the hope is that we get out of Afghanistan, that we definitely not enter another a war, that we get back into Iran's with the JCPOA, we get back into the Paris Accords, but more than that, that we set up a framework for cooperation around the world in tackling pandemics and climate change, that we lead with the commitment to solving global problems instead of lead with seeking a confrontation and escalation, that we move away from the modernization of ICBMs, which is a waste of resources, and that we get back into arms control agreements. But all of these things, I think, are possibilities if we can push to get progressives into the administration, if we can push to have those kind of actions starting in Congress.
Thank you, Congressman. Who wants to go next? Closing thoughts.
I mean, I definitely agree with everything that Congressman Ro Khanna just mentioned. Also, an immediate end to the Muslim ban. And, we've been talking about Iran, but there's so many other contexts that we need to look at. I mentioned Venezuela and Cuba. The people of Yemen are suffering because of endless US support for the Saudi regime that is making possible the genocide of the Yemeni people. We need to be supporting Palestinian liberation, and that is not going to happen until the US government ends the huge amount of military support that is going to the Israeli government on an annual basis. So those are just some other contexts that really we need to push for it to happen.
Thanks, Azadeh.
I can go next. I totally agree with everything that Azadeh just said. And I think regardless of who is in the White House, honestly, because maybe it is because my lineage of organizing and advocacy starts from Iran, where you can't count on the administration that much. Or maybe because even here you can't count on the administration. Like there is a limit to what a president can do for you. Regardless of who is in the White House next year, my hope for our movement is for us to be able to make those connections, to expand the analysis that has now, thanks to the leaders of movements for Black lives, have come to the center of like abolishing the systems of harm that is not limited to the prison industrial complex. It is the military industrial complex, it is US support for Israel, it is the occupation of Palestine. All of these solidarity movements are connected. We are not just in this fight because we feel bad for those people, we care for those people. We are in this fight because we have an analysis that shows the connections of all of these systems of harm and how they support each other. My hope, my vision for this movement is to really deepen and cultivate and build on those connections of an internationalist framework whose goal is to abolish all systems of harm anywhere on this planet that they are happening.
Great, Nahid, that was beautifully said. And Rana, you will have the closing words here.
I wish I did it. We should just end on what Nahid said, to be honest. But I'll take the political route and say, Move On is doing everything we can to mobilize our members to ensure there is a Biden-Harris win this November. It is so essential for us to have more fertile terrain to organize on. And what I am hopeful for is that all of what my co-panelists have said has possibility, not guaranteed, but there will be possibility under a Biden-Harris administration. Right now, nothing. It's just deserted. So I am very hopeful, not naive, but hopeful, and I will be elated to work with everyone here to make sure that the new administration listens and hears our voices, and that the movement continues to be powerful, and that they can't ignore us. And I like thinking of that win scenario. So thank you for having me.
Excellent, Rana. I love that future as well. And I want to thank the panelists so much for being with us today, so much for your participation and everything that you said. Thanks so much to the attendees who joined us, and hopefully thank you to the broader audience who will be able to watch this when it gets put out into the public. So with that, I think we will close the session out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.